Hi there, modern world history students. So, we're continuing with unit number 7, the rise of totalitarian dictators. And this is section 3, the First Russian Revolution, which took place in February and March of 1917. Now, you remember that Russian society was ripe for a revolution even before the First World War began. You might remember that this was a society characterized by extreme inequalities. You had the great masses of the Russian people, who were these desperately poor peasants working at backbreaking agricultural labor on the fields of the elite landowning and privileged nobles. As a matter of fact, it might remind you of France prior to its revolution. In addition to that, you had the Czar, in this case Tsar Nicholas II, and his family living in even greater luxury. And remember that the Tsar had even tried to create a sort of a false or pretend parliament called the Duma, that was sort of meant to give the Russian people the impression that they had some influence over their government, but they were underrepresented in the Duma, and the Tsar could disband it at any time he wanted. And anyway, it didn't have the power to actually make laws. In the end, the Tsar was still an absolute monarch. And then came the First World War, and Russia's crushing defeat at Tannenberg at the beginning, leading to the German invasion of Russia, which caused mass homelessness as Russian peasants had to abandon their homes in the face of the German invasion. They crowded into Russia's cities. There was not enough food because the Russian army had drafted millions of peasants off of the farms. And so there was not enough agricultural labor to produce enough grain to feed the Russian people, particularly in the big cities. There was ongoing desertions by Russian soldiers. They didn't have adequate guns. They didn't have adequate ammunition to fight the war. And then finally, there was the incompetence of the Tsar, who went out to the battlefield to command his armies personally, but of course was not able to change their fortunes. And there was suspicion of his wife, Alexandra, the Tsarina, who was ethnically German, and a widespread belief that she, perhaps in coordination with her rumored boyfriend, the weirdo Rasputin, was perhaps sabotaging the Russian war effort. So you can see how ripe Russia was for this revolution. So, after this section, I hope you'll be able to explain why events in Petrograd, the capital of Russia, also called St. Petersburg, in February and March of 1917 forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. And then I hope that you'll understand how the Provisional Government or temporary government ruled Russia in between its two revolutions. So you'll learn about the Soviet, what is called a Soviet, particularly the one that was formed in Petrograd. You'll hear about the defection of the army and the abdication of the Tsar. And then we'll describe for you the Provisional Government and its leader, Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky. So we're starting at the top of page 6. And think about how by the winter of 1916-1917, by that time the war had gone on for a little over 2 years. And Russia had been losing since the very beginning. Well, I guess not since the very beginning. At the very beginning, they had this sort of hopeful and promising start. They had surprised the Germans, right? By attacking the Germans before the Germans thought possible. The Russians had attacked the Germans with only part of their army mobilized. But then they'd been crushed at Tannenberg, and things had gone badly for them ever since. So the Russian people who had endured 2 years of losing, 2 years of invasion, 2 years of hardship, not having enough food, 2 years of news that their sons had been killed or were missing after a battle or were grievously wounded. And 2 years, too, of housing their relatives. If you were living in the cities, you probably had relatives living with you because they had fled the countryside in the face of the German invasion. And the winter of 1916-17 was a pretty typical Russian winter, pretty brutal, but it was atypical in that it ended early. There was an early thaw, so that the winter came to an end in February rather than in, say, April, which is when a Russian winter typically comes to an end. But in February, the weather began to warm up, and people began to leave their houses where they had sort of hunkered down, sort of not going out for any reason except to get essentials. But now they came out into the streets and they began to interact with each other. And this was the first time that many of them had communicated extensively with their neighbors in months. And what they all found was that they were experiencing the same things. Not enough food. They hadn't heard from their sons or their husbands or their boyfriends or their brothers who had been away in the army. Many were presumed dead. Others had defected from the army, had actually left the army. And they were all housing relatives. And so they began to realize that the problems that they were experiencing were not their own individual problems, but were systemic problems that were being experienced by everybody. And that led to growing outrage and growing dissatisfaction with the Tsar and his government, and of course with the war. The thing was, the people fully understood that the war was the main source of their suffering, the main source of their misery. And they knew that the Tsar could end it. So they were dissatisfied with the overall state of Russian society. They were dissatisfied with the war and the losing of the war. They were dissatisfied with the lack of food, and they were dissatisfied with the Tsar. And so in February of 1917, you had these massive public protests that began in Petrograd, which is the capital. So originally it was called St. Petersburg, but technically it was called Sankt Petersburg in Russian. But even the burg at the end there was actually, it had a German sound. Burg is the German word for city. And when Tsar Peter the Great had established St. Petersburg, he had named it that with a German-sounding name in order to give it more of a Western European flair, a Western European sound. Now, at war against the Germans, nobody wanted their capital to have a German-sounding name, so they changed it to Petrograd, which is a more Russian Petrograd, grad being the Russian word for city. So in the capital, in the streets of the capital, Petrograd, there were these protests, mass protests against the war, the lack of food, the inequalities of society, and the Tsar. Now think about it. All throughout the 19th century, there had been protests. There were nationalist revolts, there were liberal revolts. And if you remember, in 1905, there had even been a revolt in Petrograd during the Russo-Japanese War. And all of these revolts, or at least most of them, had all ended in the same way. They had ended with the government calling in the army and the army crushing the revolts. There were a few that succeeded. Remember the Belgians, for example, and they gained their independence. But for the most part, these revolts throughout the 19th century were crushed. And the one in 1905, too, had been crushed by the forces of the Tsar. Remember Bloody Sunday. And so now the Tsar, faced with protests once again in the streets of the capital, as well as other major cities, by the way, too, in Moscow and other major cities, the Tsar called out the army. As a matter of fact, the protests in Petrograd were so large that the Tsar brought in over 200,000 soldiers. 200,000 Russian soldiers were called in off the battlefield to move into Petrograd and put an end to these protests. What the Tsar perhaps did not think about or calculate was the fact that there were probably no Russians who suffered more because of the war than Russian soldiers. They were the ones who were being sent out again and again to fight a German army that was so much better equipped than they were. Remember that the average Russian soldier, I should say only 1 out of 4 Russian soldiers had a working gun. And the average Russian soldier carried only 9 bullets. While the German army, of course, was fully equipped, fully modernized with machine guns and artillery. And so for the Russian soldier, the war had been, from the very beginning, seemingly a suicide mission. They too didn't have enough food. They too suffered from the cold. They were out on the battlefield in the middle of the Russian winter. So perhaps the Tsar should have considered that no one was suffering from the war more than his soldiers. And maybe he should have predicted that when he called 200,000 soldiers into the capital, into Petrograd, to crush the protest of the people, that instead the soldiers might go the opposite direction, which is what they did. The soldiers who were moved into Petrograd to crush the protests instead joined the protests. They didn't side with the Czar, as the Czar expected they would. Instead, they sided with the protesters, and they joined the protesters. And that was the moment at which the Tsar, whether he knew it or not, although he was quickly about to figure it out, that was the point at which he was done. Because once you've lost your army, you really have no way to keep yourself in power unless the people want you there. And at this point, the Russian people didn't want him there anymore. And so when the Russian soldiers who had been sent to Petrograd to crush the protests joined it instead, that was the critical moment of the Russian Revolution. The soldiers and the workers. So there weren't a lot of factory workers in Russia. Russia was not a very modernized society. As we've said, it was more of a feudal society. It looked a lot more like a medieval society with peasants in the countryside rather than a proletariat, a working class of factory workers in the cities. But there were some factories in the big cities. And so the workers of those factories joined with the soldiers who had turned against the Tsar to form what was called a Soviet. So a Soviet, it's a Russian word, and it essentially means a council. And during the Russian Revolution, the first Russian Revolution, a Soviet then was a council of workers and soldiers, or at least it was a council of the representatives of the workers and soldiers, or of the deputies of the workers and soldiers. And Soviets were formed in all of the major cities. During the Russian Revolution, the first Soviet was established in Petrograd, of course, the capital, where the major protests began. So the first Soviet, the first Council of Workers and Soldiers Representatives, was established in Petrograd, and it's known as the Petrograd Soviet. And the Petrograd Soviet, because it was the first and arguably the most important, the Petrograd Soviet sort of claimed to speak for the other Soviets. Even though independent Soviets were being established in all the major cities, the Petrograd Soviet sort of saw itself as the supreme Soviet, the one which spoke for all the others. And the way that it worked was this. Every unit of the Russian army in and around Petrograd was invited to elect one soldier to represent it in the Soviet. And you can see them, I think, seated here. They're all sort of uniform. They're all wearing the uniform of the Russian army. And then each factory in Petrograd was invited to elect one representative. Although large factories were invited to elect one representative for every 1,000 workers. So if you have a factory that hired 5,000 workers, they'd have 5 representatives. And they now claimed that they were the new government. Even though the Tsar was still seated on the throne, even though the Tsar still at this point claimed to be the absolute monarch and ruler of Russia, the Petrograd Soviet now claimed that right. They claimed the right to sort of make the laws for Russia. And so this was a sort of reminiscent of the National Assembly during the French Revolution. You remember how even while Louis XVI was still, in his mind, the absolute ruler, monarch of France, the National Assembly had established itself at the tennis court. And you had these sort of parallel governments, a traditional government, the monarch, and a revolutionary government, the assembly. Well, same here. At this point, at least, Tsar Nicholas II was still on the throne, and yet you had this alternative government, the Soviet. Meanwhile, other Soviet soldiers joined with some of the civilians to form a sort of a little army called the People's Militia. And the People's Militia was, of course, not obedient to the Tsar, but was obedient to the Soviet. So again, think about the French Revolution. You had the National Assembly, and you had the National Guard. And the National Guard was sort of responsible to the National Assembly. It was not loyal to the king. It was responsible to the assembly. Well, same here. The People's Militia, a combination of of soldiers plus civilians, they were loyal to the Soviet, not to the Tsar. And as a matter of fact, they began rounding up the Tsar's secret police. So like all of the other monarchies of Europe, ever since Metternich had encouraged them to do so, the Tsar had created a secret police to help root out radicals, root out people who might be spreading dangerous ideas. They were the secret police were sort of the last source of any power that the Tsar had. The army didn't support him anymore. The secret police remained loyal to the Tsar. So now the people's militia rounded up and arrested the Tsar's secret police, at which point he had no basis in power at all. The people didn't support him anymore. The army wouldn't fight for him anymore. And the secret police who would have stood up for him were now arrested and imprisoned. So, on March 7th, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II faced facts. He had no basis upon which to rule Russia any longer, and so he abdicated. So to abdicate means to sort of voluntarily step down from power, to step down from the throne. And that is what Tsar Nicholas II did. He stepped down as Tsar. This is a photograph of him taken shortly thereafter, out in the countryside somewhere with some of his loyal army officers. He was facing facts. He was facing reality. He had no basis any longer to claim power over Russia, so he abdicated. He was probably trying to save himself and his family. I mean, everybody remembers what happened to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, right? So perhaps the Tsar, in facing facts and in abdicating rather than being forced out of power, he was perhaps trying to save himself. Meanwhile, all throughout Russia, the news of the abdication of the Tsar was greeted with great joy amongst regular people anyway. Certainly not amongst the Russian nobles or the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, but amongst the regular people, great joy, great satisfaction to hear that the Tsar had abdicated. And now they began to try to eliminate every symbol of the Tsar and his power. So statues of the Tsars from the past were torn down. You're seeing some people having climbed up to a rooftop here. They were prying loose a coat of arms. So the coat of arms was the symbol of the Romanov family, the Tsar's family, which had ruled Russia for really just about over 300 years at that point. It's being pried loose, and it looks like they're going to replace it with the red flag of revolution. And so all over Russia, the symbols of the Tsar's power were being stripped down and destroyed in celebration of the fact that Tsar Nicholas II had abdicated. And now I want to move to the bottom of page 6. So here's the thing. You've eliminated the Tsar, and that's great. Obviously the Russian people were very satisfied, very happy with that. The problem is you need a government. The Tsar as absolute monarch had essentially been Russia's government. There was no other government of Russia at that point. But you need a government. And mainly you need a government because the war is still going on. You can't just sort of call time out and ask the Germans to stop their invasion and give you time to write a constitution. They're not going to do that. So the Russians now needed really to do two things at once. They needed to write a constitution to create a permanent government for Russia, but they also needed a government that would be a temporary government that would lead them through the war effort, that would continue their war effort. And so that's why a provisional government was formed, a provisional government. So provisional here simply means temporary. The provisional government was never intended to be Russia's permanent government. It was to provide a government for Russia. It was to provide leadership for Russia during the period in between the abdication of the Tsar and the creation of a new constitution. And so this provisional government was never intended to be permanent. It was meant to be a temporary government to get Russia through the crisis, to provide leadership as the war continued, as the German invasion continued, while the Constitution was being written. Now, of course, you had the Duma. And the leaders of the Duma sort of assumed that they would take on the leadership role in the new government. The leaders of the Duma assumed that they would be the legislative branch, making laws for Russia. Because after all, they had been around by this time for for 12 years. They had been Russia's sort of fake parliament or pretend parliament under the Czar. Now they could assume the role of being Russia's real parliament. But you remember there were serious flaws with the Duma, most notably that so few of the regular Russian people were actually represented there. And so much of the Duma was reserved for Russia's elites, nobles, church leaders, and factory owners, even though there weren't very many factory owners. And so, as the provisional government began to take shape, and as the Duma attempted to assert itself as the new government, the leaders of the Petrograd Soviet, that is the Council of the Workers and Soldiers, said, "Not so fast, my friend. We intend to be the legislature in this new government because we represent the Russian people much more so than the Duma does." And so what happened is, in the provisional government, they shared power. The Duma was included, and the Petrograd Soviet was included in the new temporary or provisional government. They shared legislative power. They shared the power to make laws, much in the same way that the House of Representatives and the Senate share the power to make laws in our national legislature, in our Congress. In the Duma, the wealthier people's interests were represented more. And in the Petrograd Soviet, the common people's interests were represented. And so together, they shared power. Any law that was going to be passed by the provisional government had to be approved by both the Duma and the Petrograd Soviet. Serving as the executive in this government was a man named Alexander Kerensky. And Kerensky was an interesting character, and he was the right person for the job in a way, because he had been one of the elected members of the Duma prior to the revolution. So he was trusted by the wealthier, more elites of the Duma, but also he had been elected to the Soviet. He'd been elected to both the Duma and the Soviet. So he was trusted by the wealthier elites, and he was trusted by the common people. And so he was chosen to serve as prime minister. He would be the executive. If the two houses were the ones who were passing laws, then Kerensky's job was to carry out the laws, to see to it that the laws were carried out. So he served as prime minister. Now, there was a lot of support for the provisional government at the very beginning. This support was built around the fact that the provisional government had replaced the Czar, and nobody liked the Czar, and that the provisional government was a sort of a democratic government, a representative government. So there was great support for the provisional government at the outset. However, that support began to slide very, very quickly when Kerensky and the other leaders of the provisional government decided to continue Russia's war effort. They believed that Russia had a chance to still win the war, and that if Russia stuck it out, they could end up on the winning side. Kerensky believed that the main reason why the Russian army was failing was that they were not motivated to fight for the Czar. Well, he was right. The Russian army was not motivated to fight for the Czar. But that wasn't the only reason they were failing. He believed that now the Russian army would be more motivated to fight. He believed that since Russia now had a people's government, a government in which the people had representation, he believed that the Russian soldiers would now be more motivated to fight. And he may have been right about that. But the fundamental mistake was lack of motivation is not why the Russian army was losing the war. Russia was losing the war because their army was so poorly equipped, because Russian society was so backward, so non-modernized, that they didn't have enough guns and they didn't have enough bullets. And so the decision to continue the war, with the thinking being that the Russians would now begin to win because Russian soldiers would be more motivated to fight for a government that represented them instead of the Tsar, that was the flaw. And the other problem was this misunderstanding of the Russian people too. The Russian people It's not that they didn't want to fight the war because they didn't want to fight for the Czar. It's not that they didn't want to continue the war because they didn't trust the Czar, although that was part of it. The war was the chief source of their own suffering and misery. And so, in just about every way, the decision made by the Provisional Government, by Kerensky and the other leaders of the Provisional Government to continue the war, was a fateful and catastrophic decision for Russia, and particularly for the Provisional Government. And it would open the door then to a second Russian Revolution coming in October and November of the same year of 1917. So I want to get a little bit down the road on who then led that second Russian Revolution. And so we're going to begin section 4 here, and we'll finish it in the next lesson. So the second Russian Revolution of October and November 1917. In this part of it, I hope you'll be able to explain how political divisions in Russia created conditions for a second revolution. We'll talk about the second thing in the next lesson, how the Bolsheviks, led by V.I. Lenin, seized power during the second revolution. But for now, I just want to talk about the political divisions that created the conditions for a second revolution. So today we'll talk about V.I. Lenin's Bolsheviks, we'll introduce you to them. We'll also introduce you to the people called Mensheviks or Czarists or counter-revolutionaries. So I'm taking you to the top of page 7 and specifically to the upper left-hand corner. Now you'll see that I have 3 political groups. We're talking about political divisions within the Provisional Government. And you'll see that we've got 3 political groups listed here. We have Bolsheviks, we have Mensheviks, and we have Czarists. And you'll see that I have them arranged from left to right. That's because of a concept called the political spectrum. You probably know what a spectrum is. Like if you're thinking about light, the spectrum of visible light runs from red to purple or violet, right? Think about the spectrum think about the rainbow. And in between you have other colors, and they sort of fade one into another. Red fades into orange, which fades into yellow, which fades into green, which fades into blue, which fades into violet, right? So you have this whole spectrum, you have a whole range of colors. Well, in politics, you can have a whole range of beliefs. And so oftentimes people's political beliefs are arranged on a spectrum as well. On the far left are the people who are favorable to change. So people on the left want change. They want things to be different from what they are. And the farther left you go, the more change you want, until on the farthest left, you have what are called revolutionaries, people who want total change, a complete overturning of everything. In the middle, you have people who are moderates. And moderates are people who are sort of satisfied with the way things are. Perhaps there have been some changes and they're satisfied with those changes. They don't see the need for more change, but they certainly don't want to go back to the way things were before. And so those are moderates in the middle. And then on the right, you have people who are called reactionaries. These are the people who are unhappy about changes that have happened, and they want to get rid of those changes. They want to go back to the way things were before those changes. They're also sometimes called counter-revolutionaries. So if people on the far left are revolutionaries who want total change, counter-revolutionaries are people who are dissatisfied with the changes that have happened, and they want to go back to the way things were. So you can call the people on the far right counter-revolutionaries. They're also sometimes called reactionaries. But let's start on the far left. On the far left, these are the revolutionaries. These are the people who are not satisfied with the changes that have taken place so far. They want more change. They want additional change. They want a complete overturning of the way everything was. And in Russia, during the Russian Revolution, that position on the far left, the position of the revolutionaries, was filled by people known as Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks were the communists in Russia. We've talked about what communism is. You learned about communism in Unit 4. Remember, communists are people who want a revolution in order to achieve total equality in society. Remember that communism wants the people to overthrow the government, And then they want the government to take over all of the farms, all of the factories, all of the railroads, and they want the government to own and operate the farms, the factories, and the railroads in such a way that the workers will all receive what would be called their fair share of the value that they helped to create. So remember that communists believe that in capitalism, workers don't get their fair share of the value that they help to create through their labor. And that's why workers end up poor and factory owners end up rich. The factory owners are exploiting, they're taking advantage of the workers. And that's why the factory owners are rich and the workers are poor. So the Bolsheviks are communists. They want this kind of revolution in Russia. They want the people to overthrow the government. They want the government to take over control of the farms and the factories and operate them to promote total equality in society. That was the goal of Russia's communists, total equality. So who are the Bolsheviks? They're the communists. Why are they on the far left? Why are they considered revolutionaries, even during a revolution? Because they weren't satisfied with the changes that the Russian Revolution had achieved. They were happy that the Czar was gone, just as everybody else was. But the creation of the abdication of the Czar and the Provisional Government did not mean that suddenly everybody in Russia was equal. The creation of the Provisional Government and the creation of probably a constitution created by the Provisional Government was not going to eliminate inequality in Russian society. So the Bolsheviks were not satisfied with the first Russian Revolution. They wanted a continuation of the revolution, or a second revolution that would result in the establishment of communism in Russia. So they are the revolutionaries. They're on the far left. Why do they call themselves the Bolsheviks? Well, Bolshevik in Russian means big party or majority party. And here we're not talking about like a party, we're talking about a political party. So what they were saying by calling themselves Bolsheviks is, we are the party that represents the majority of the Russian people. Whether they actually did or not, they didn't care. But in their mind, they represented the great majority of the Russian people and were fighting for the interests of the majority of the Russian people, not a small group of elites. They were standing up for the common people. So they called themselves the Bolsheviks, the big party or the majority party. They were associated with the color red, the color of revolution, because they were revolutionaries. They wanted total change, a complete overturning of the whole social structure of Russia. And their leader was V.I. Lenin. And we'll talk more about him in our next lesson. But their leader was V.I. Lenin. You just sort of hold on to that for now. So on the far left are the revolutionaries. They want total change, complete overturning of Russian society. In this case, they are Bolsheviks, meaning majority party. They are the communists. They want a complete overturning of Russian society so that they can create an equal society, a society of equals. And their leader is V.I. Lenin. All right, moving on to the moderates. So the moderates, these are going to be the people who were satisfied with the changes that had been achieved so far. So who would that be? Well, that's the Duma and the Provisional Government and Kerensky and the people who support it. These were people who were very pleased that the Tsar was gone. They were pleased that the Tsar had abdicated and that this was opening the door for a new kind of government in Russia. They were happy that Russia's new government would be a democratic government, a government that was more representative of the Russian people, a government in which the Russian people had a real voice and real influence. And so these were the supporters. These were the people who were supporters of the Provisional Government, the moderates in Russia, satisfied with the changes achieved so far, but not seeing the need for a lot more radical change. Unlike the Bolsheviks or communists who wanted to see a complete overturning of everything in Russian society, the moderates saw no need for that. The important change that had to be achieved, in their view, was the elimination of the monarchy, the elimination of the Tsar, and the creation of a government that was more responsive to the Russian people. And that's what had been achieved with the creation of the Provisional Government. So in their mind, there was no need for additional change. They were satisfied with the change that had been accomplished to that point. Their leader was Alexander Kerensky, of course, the leader of the Provisional Government, the Prime Minister of the Provisional Government. Now notice that they are referred to as Mensheviks. They did not call themselves Mensheviks. That was a name that was given to them by the Bolsheviks. Because in the eyes of the Bolsheviks, these were people who were not representing the needs or the interests of the great majority of the Russian people. These were people who were still representing the elites because they, the moderates, were not going to take the steps needed to eliminate inequality in Russian society. So the Bolsheviks refer to these people as Mensheviks, small party, minority party. They didn't call themselves that, the Bolsheviks called them that, but the name sort of stuck. So you had the Bolsheviks, the revolutionaries looking for a complete change leading to equality in Russian society. You had the Mensheviks, who were the moderates, people satisfied with the change that had been achieved up to that point, satisfied with the end of the monarchy, satisfied with the creation of a representative government, and not seeking additional change. And then on the far right, we have the counter-revolutionaries, the people who are unhappy about the changes, the people who want to go back to the way things were. And these were Czarists. These were the monarchists, people who favored the monarchy, people who benefited from the monarchy. So you can imagine that would, of course, be the Czar and the royal family. That would be all of the nobles, because the land that the nobles possessed was land that they possessed because it had been granted to them by the Czar or by a past Czar going back in history. It was the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, because their privilege and their power was tied in with the monarchy as well. So the Czarists were counter-revolutionaries. They were against what had happened in the revolution so far. They didn't like the elimination of the monarchy. They wanted to bring back the monarchy, restore the Czar to absolute power. And of course, their leader was Tsar Nicholas II himself. Remember, he had abdicated. He was still alive, and he was out there and ready to fight to return to power. So these Czarists then were on the far right, the counter-revolutionaries or reactionaries, unhappy with the change from an absolute monarchy to a representative government and hoping to restore the absolute monarchy at some point. Now you notice that I've got a box that connects the Mensheviks and the Czarists together. And the reason why I do that is this. Looking at things from the Bolsheviks' perspective, which is going to be important because the Bolsheviks will be the leaders of the Second Russian Revolution. Looking at things from the Bolsheviks' perspective, they didn't see the Mensheviks and the Czarists as being particularly different from each other. Now to us looking at it goes, that's crazy. The Mensheviks want a representative type of government, like a democracy. The Czarists want an absolute monarchy. They're very different from each other. But from the Bolsheviks' perspective, they weren't. From the Bolsheviks' perspective, neither the Mensheviks nor the Czarists would do what it takes to eliminate the inequalities in Russian society. Neither the representative government of the Mensheviks or the absolute monarchy of the Czarists would achieve that complete overturning of Russia's social structure. Neither of them was going to place the farms and the factories and the railroads in the hands of the government. Neither of them was going to operate the farms and the factories and the railroads in order to eliminate inequality and ensure that the workers got their full share of the value they created. And so in the eyes of the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks and the Czarists were not different from each other. And that's what I want you to write down as you take your notes in that little box there. That from the Bolshevik perspective, the Mensheviks and the Czarists were the same. And as crazy as that sounds to us, because the Mensheviks favored representative government and the Czarists wanted a monarchy, in the eyes of the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks and the Czarists were on the same team. They were cut from the same cloth. They were not going to do what it takes to create a society of equals. So the Bolsheviks regarded the Mensheviks and the Czarists as both of them as the enemy. And they associated the Mensheviks and the Czarists with the color white, which was the color of the Tsar's family. So the Bolsheviks associated themselves with the color red, the color of revolution. They associated the Mensheviks and the Czarists with the color white, the color of not the revolution, the color of the royal family. All right, so we've sort of laid out for you the political divisions that existed during the months when the provisional government was in power in Russia. In our next lesson, you'll learn about V.I. Lenin, and you'll learn how he led a second revolution in Russia that led to the creation of a communist dictatorship. So until then, take care of yourselves. Stay healthy, stay safe. I'll look forward to teaching you again soon. Bye-bye, Modern World History students.